Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Maple Grove Scripture Reading Podcast. So last time we were in the first 8 verses of chapter 35, and Elihu made the case that God is so transcendent and self-sufficient that human conduct doesn't reach him. Your sin doesn't injure God. Your righteousness doesn't give God anything that he didn't already have. The effects of how you live are real. They run horizontally, though, through the human community, not vertically up to a God who needs something from you. The implication was that God, having no self-interested stake in how he treats you, can therefore be trusted to be completely just. Well, today we're going to be in verses 9 through 16, where Elihu turns from God's transcendence to a harder question. Why doesn't God answer when people cry out? So let me read through that. People cry out under a load of oppression. They plead for relief from the arm of the powerful, but no one says, "Where is God, my maker, who gives songs in the night, who teaches us more than he teaches the beasts of the earth and makes us wiser than the birds in the sky?" He does not answer when people cry out because of the arrogance of the wicked. Indeed, God does not listen to their empty plea. The Almighty pays no attention to it. How much less, then, will he listen when you say that you do not see him, that your case is before him, and you must wait for him, and further, that his anger never punishes, and he does not take the least notice of wickedness. So Job opens his mouth with empty talk. Without knowledge, he multiplies words. So Elihu opens with a scene that everybody in the ancient world understood. People crushed under oppression. Workers ground down by hard masters. The poor who have no recourse in the human court system. And so they cry out. The sound goes up, but nothing comes back. Job had pointed to this very thing. Back in chapter 24, he described people laboring in someone else's fields and going home hungry. Children taken in payment for debt, the homeless shivering without shelter. He looked at the full picture of human suffering and asked where God was in any of it. That was one of the things that made Job's complaint serious. He wasn't just arguing about his own case. He was looking at the whole structure of suffering in the world and asked an honest question about divine justice. And Elihu is not denying the scene. Yes, people cry out under oppression. That is not in dispute. But his argument is that the problem is not God's absence. The problem is that the people who are crying out are not crying in the right direction. He starts by saying, but no one says, "Where is God, my maker, who gives songs in the night?" It's where Elihu is going to land the weight of his argument. This is a line that would make a difference, and it isn't being spoken. There's a difference between crying out in pain and crying out to God. One is just the reflex of pain, and the other is prayer. One comes from the nerve endings. The other requires turning towards something outside yourself and making an appeal. The people in verse 9 are crying, but they aren't asking where their maker is. They aren't looking for him. They aren't turning toward the one who could actually help. Who gives songs in the night? Night in the Old Testament is the consistent image of trial and darkness, the deepest part of the worst time. And Elihu says that God can give songs there. Not songs after the night ends, when morning finally comes, but songs in the middle of it, while the darkness is still fully dark. This has been verified in thousands of cases across human history. People have looked up through tears and found that God put something like praise in their mouths, even in the worst part of it. You can look at Acts 16, Paul and Silas, who were beaten and then locked in an inner cell with feet in stocks and singing hymns, though, at midnight. That's kind of the image of this. That's what's available. Not the removal of the suffering, not yet, but something that can live inside the suffering. A song when there's no natural reason for one. The people Elihu is describing aren't accessing that. They're crying from pain. They haven't asked for the song. He continues, who teaches us more than he teaches the beasts of the earth and makes us wiser than the birds in the sky? So Elihu's making a little quiet point here that sets up the critique that he's building toward. Animals suffer without understanding anything about why. A horse labors in the heat without any knowledge of what its work is for. A bird in a storm has no ability to reason about the nature of storms or the hand behind weather. They endure what comes to them, and they have no framework for asking why or for whom. Human beings are made differently. We have the capacity to ask, where is God, my maker? And to receive something back, to reflect on suffering and learn from it, to see, even if only partially, what the affliction is meant to accomplish, to hear what God is saying through it, rather than just experiencing it as a raw sensation. But that capacity only does anything if it's used. If people under suffering respond no differently than animals, like they're just crying from pain without seeking the God who can explain and sustain, then the gift of intelligence accomplishes nothing. There's an implied critique here of anybody who has suffered and complained without ever using their human capacity to look for God. The gift creates responsibility. We can do more than just feel the pain. He continues saying he did not answer when people cry out because of the arrogance of the wicked. And so this is the direct explanation. It's not absence. It's not indifference. The cry is going unanswered because of pride. Indeed, God does not listen to their empty plea, he says. A hollow prayer, a prayer that's really just a demand, a sound made in pain that has no actual reaching toward God in it. It comes from a posture of self-assertion rather than supplication. The people crying out under oppression haven't moved toward God. They've cried at the situation, at the oppressor. They've not humbled themselves before the one who could actually help. This principle is still true now as it was in Elihu's day. Pride keeps people from praying even in their worst suffering. They've built their lives on their own resources and have no practice of dependence. And even when everything collapses, the posture doesn't change. They'd rather complain about what's happening than humble themselves before God. That pride is the reason the night stays dark. Not because God can't give the song, but because nobody's asking for it. There are people whose suffering stays entirely unrelieved. And it's not because God is absent, but because they've never really turned to him. They've cried, but they've not prayed. And there's a necessary correction that needs to be made here too, though. Elihu's principle is sound as a general principle. Hollow prayers go unanswered. God doesn't respond to empty demands that have no real seeking of him in them. That's true. But Elihu seems to be applying this principle to Job specifically, as though Job's prayers have been hollow prayers, lacking any real seeking of God. And that's probably going too far. Job's words were sometimes extreme. His complaints went to the edge and occasionally went over it, but it wasn't hollow. He was a man who had built his life on God and kept arguing with God even when everything was gone, which is itself a kind of faith. You don't argue with somebody that you believe has abandoned you completely. Job was still in the relationship, still demanding something from God, still expecting God to be the God he had always known. So the principle is right, but the application to Job, not quite right. That gap between sound theology and misapplied judgment is going to follow Elihu all the way to the end of his speeches. He continues, how much less then will he listen when you say that you do not see him, that your case is before him, and you must wait for him? And this is addressed to Job directly. It goes back to chapter 23, where Job described trying to find God everywhere and failing. He went east, west, north, south, but God was simply unreachable, and Job couldn't get close enough to argue his case. Elihu's word here is that the invisibility of God is not a reason to stop trusting him. Your case is before him. Even when you can't see him, even when you can't find him, he hasn't lost track of your situation. He hasn't forgotten what's happening to you. Not being able to see God is not the same as God not being present, and it's not evidence that he has stopped caring about what is just. This is one of Elihu's better arguments, not because it solves Job's specific problem, but because it names something real about what trust actually requires. Anybody can trust what they can verify. Trusting the invisible, apparently absent God, staying in the relationship when all the felt evidence of it seems to have gone quiet, that's the harder thing. And that's what Elihu is asking of Job. Job had kept pushing for a direct encounter. He wanted to argue his case face to face, to hear God's response, to have the silence broken. The longing itself wasn't wrong. But Elihu is saying that what the moment requires is not an audience, it's trust. Patiently holding on to what you know about God when what you feel about God is nothing but darkness. So the chapter ends with Elihu's summary. So Job opened his mouth with empty talk. Without knowledge, he multiplies words. It's the same verdict as chapter 34. Job speaks without knowledge. His words lack the grounding that genuine understanding would provide. So again, this is probably harsher than the evidence is supporting. Job had real knowledge of God and real experience of what honest faith looks like under fire. His words were sometimes immoderate. He overstated at points, but calling it all empty talk misses the weight of what Job actually carried. Elihu's frustration with Job's arguments has led him to a verdict that's sharper than what his arguments justify. That's Elihu's pattern. The theology is solid. The verdict on Job is too severe. He sees the principle clearly, but applies it with less clarity than what he should. So next time we're going to get into chapter 36, and Elihu's going to start a new speech, his fourth one. And the Hebrew text actually marks this as an addition beyond the extended number of speeches in the debate. And he's going to go somewhere that he hasn't been yet. Hope you have a great day. We'll talk again soon. God bless.